Get to how we keep our lights shining. And really, we've heard a lot today about how we keep our lights shining. And I'll come back to it. It's really simple. Be in the Word. Apply the Word to our lives. Obey it. Be with godly people. Sometimes we have to realize, where our choices can take us. And I think that's what Jim's showing us. My dad used to tell me, you got no business hanging around outside of a bar after dark, son. What good is going to happen there? See, I lived in Germany, and I was legally able to drink at 16 years old. I don't drink alcohol, but I did, and I got in a lot of trouble. We don't understand those things when our frontal lobes aren't fully developed, and some of us, even afterwards, don't quite get it yet. And for you young folks that don't know, scientifically now we think that happens, ladies a little earlier, around 23, if I remember correctly, and with guys sometimes not till 26 or 27. It's amazing how wise my dad became once I had my first kid, my only kid. Some of that stuff makes sense. They talked about the darkness, right? The darkness hides our deeds. There's a reason, evil and creeps come out at night. And if we're not aware of who we're hanging out with, because there are warning signs. When your parents or somebody in the church goes, hey, yeah, I want you to love those people, but you need to be careful about the influence they have over you. There's a reason they're telling you that. It's not because they're not cool. It's because they love you. And they want to keep you out of trouble. I want to read from Romans chapter 1. Let's get into God's Word. Romans chapter 1. And we're going to read about a very short version of the fall of man, if you will, into kind of sin and depravity. And talk about that for a moment. Because really this is about how do we keep that from happening. And we got to understand. We don't have to live it, but we have to understand it. Romans chapter 1, verse 18, and I'm going to read a lengthy reading here. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. C.S. Lewis called that the God void. That we are seeking for something. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural, and in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire to one another, men with men, committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which they are not proper. Do we think that all of a sudden Adam woke up one day and said, I don't really like Eve anymore. Steve looks pretty good. Not to be gross. This is what we're reading about, and this is what we see in the world all around us. No, that didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened a little bit at a time. And that's what some of us have been talking about, these decisions that we make. It starts small. It starts small. I'm too tired to get down the edge of my bed and pray tonight. I mean, you don't have to get down on your knees at the edge of your bed. That's not a demanded posture. That's my preference. You do it however you do it. But what happens when I start going, I'm too tired to end my day by reflecting and talking with God? What happens? What happens when Brother Paul, he writes about how we know that, when we're talking about how in latter times there will be people who will forbid men to marry. We were looking at that, we were looking at the passage before that, I believe earlier today. But anyhow, forbid men to marry and teach that you have to abstain from certain foods. And he goes, no, that's crazy. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he talks about how we know all things are clean when they're taken with thanks. What happens when I stop giving thanks? What happens? Well, what happened to these folks is they stopped worshiping God. And they started making idols that looked more like them or more like animals. And they wanted to not have to strive to God's standard, but rather come up with their own idea of God that allowed them to just live by their standard. And they went farther and farther and farther down that path until they started doing things and having relationships that are damaging and hurtful and improper. And verse 32, I think, is very telling. We'll skip ahead a little bit. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to that. How did people choose to stop worshiping God and start doing inappropriate things? What happened a little bit at a time. I came from a good home. I'll tell you a little bit of my story. We don't have time to, nor would all of it be appropriate, but I came from a good home. Not a member of the church by any means, but a good upper middle class home. My father was an officer in the military. We always had good meals. We had a reasonably safe place to live. We had good health care, and I got to see some exotic destinations. When I was in high school, and my parents, although not members of the church, were very conservatively minded in far as right and wrong. My dad, I don't think, really believed in God much when I was younger. My mother was raised as a Baptist, and so she did teach me some foundational principles about God and about the Bible. But drugs and alcohol. Well, no, alcohol was a big part of life, but drugs were an absolute no-no. And yet I went down a path that spiraled until I hit bottom of alcohol and drugs and whatever felt good was good, just like the world tells us, right? If it feels good, it is good. Well, the answer to that is no, it's not. But that's what the world tells us. And how did I do that? How did I go from being in a home where, physical fitness and getting good grades and getting into a good college and setting yourself up for worldly success were very important values. How did I go from that to wasting my talents for a number of years with alcohol and drugs? It started a little bit at a time. When I was in high school, my parents listened to a lot of rock and roll, a lot of country, so I was rather eclectic in that regard. But where I went to school, there was a lot of hip-hop, and hip-hop was big on the scene. And so I caught myself as a frustrated young man, listening to things constantly. Music was a great escape for me. But I was filling my head with conversations about treating women inappropriately, treating them like dogs, drinking, smoking pot nonstop, and violence. If you understand rap, or the rap of that day, that's what it was about. Not all of it, but most of it. And so all of a sudden, I went from a just say no guy to a guy who was, I hear about it all the time. All my friends are doing it. Maybe I'll just try it once. And once became a lifestyle. It started by putting the wrong things in my mind. And that thought became action. I'm already about out of time. I was incredibly fortunate. I'm here today. When I was in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, I got to go into a county prison. This is long before I worked in the prison. And I was asked to come in and give a sermon. And I ran into a bunch of guys that I used to run around with. And that was an eye-opener. I don't know why I get to be here today when so many people end up not here or in the place where I worked. But I have to take every opportunity to be thankful to the good Lord for the forgiveness that He offers and live for Him. So how do we keep from making bad decisions in the 3 or 4 minutes that I have left? John 8, 31 through 36, if you want to make a note of that passage. We have to know Jesus. We have to know His Word. And we have to obey His Word. We have to fill up with His Word. I believe in there somewhere Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." In Matthew 15 and in Mark 7, Jesus discussed, I mentioned this earlier, that it's not what we eat, but rather it's the overflow of our heart that comes out of our mouths that makes us unclean. So don't put garbage in your hearts. Don't put garbage in your minds. And I realize that this makes me incredibly unpopular. But if you're being entertained by sin, you're watching the wrong things. If you're being entertained by sin, you're listening to the wrong things. When Paul was at the church at Philippi, in chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, that one I want to read briefly. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, what is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. That means think about these. That's what we're supposed to be consuming. The things you have learned and received and heard, the things you have learned and received in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul also writes, after a lengthy discussion to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, do not be deceived, bad company corrupts good morals. He goes on to say, become sober-minded as you ought and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. Jim shared the tragic story that is a part of his life and all of our lives here at Mariposa. I've shared how taking in garbage, spiritual, ethical garbage, negatively affected my life. To the point that it almost ended my life. To the point I got brought up on aggravated assault charges. It was not healthy. I was in a lot of places I didn't need to be. How do we keep from going there? How do we keep from going there? We've got to be in the Word. Fill up with that. Think on good and holy things. We've got to imitate success, spiritual success. Imitate godly brothers and sisters. Hang out with them. Learn from them. And we have to avoid hanging out with people that are running in the wrong direction. When we're with the world, that's evangelism time. And you shouldn't run from evangelism time. But you have to balance that with strengthening and building time from the Lord's people. And your time with the Lord's people needs to outweigh your time with the world, because they will zap you of your energy and strength quickly. You need to be recharged and refilled more than you're being drained. It's a simple, simple combination. Eat right, spiritually. Eat right. Right? Practice right with godly people, and then you will perform right in the world. Those of you who play sports, it works. It works. That can get your rest, but that's important too. Anyhow, and you will never rest better than when you're with the Lord's people. That is a peaceful place, or it should be. Thank you so much for your time. I hope today has been as edifying to you as it has been to me.